Back in 1954, the social psychologist Gordon Allport published a book, The Nature of Prejudice. It had more than 30 chapters across hundreds and hundreds of pages. It was a real feat of scholarship. And you might think, well, sure, back in those days, racism was rampant. He had a lot to explain. And yeah, the situation wasn't great. Polling firms have been asking people questions about race for a long time, so we can peer back into history. In the US, for example, in 1958, just a few years after Allport's book on prejudice came out, Gallup asked people if they approved or disapproved of marriage between white and black people. Only 4% of people approved of interracial marriage. But when we look at polling today, the message couldn't be more different. When Gallup asked Americans about interracial marriage in 2021, 94% of people approved. Now, that remaining 6% is wild to me, but still, 94% is about as close to consensus as you get. A Pew survey from last year found that 74% of white Americans agree with efforts to address racial inequality, or even think they haven't gone far enough. So that's a huge change over time. Racism has receded a ton, right? Well, sorta. The beliefs people express, even that they're truly committed to, might not be the whole story. I recently learned about this experiment that some economists did a few years ago on eBay, that online auction site. They bought up hundreds of old baseball cards. Not the rarest, most sought-after cards, but not junk either. They spent around $10 for each one. And a few weeks later, they posted those same cards for sale themselves. They used exactly the same descriptions as when they bought the cards. Starting bids were always 99 cents, and they were on the site for 7 days. Sold to the highest bidder. But, so why am I telling you about some economist's side hustle? Well, they got sneaky. If you've ever bought a thing on the internet, you know that you usually get to see that thing before you decide to buy. So they needed to take pictures of the cards they were selling. And in a real amateur move, they would just hold a card in their hand against a solid background and snap a photo. Voila. It was no Ansel Adams, but it would do. But here's the thing. This was all very intentional because it wasn't always the same hand holding the card. Sometimes it was a white guy holding the card, and sometimes it was a black guy holding the card. But people noticed, and we know they noticed because even though those hands meant nothing at all, the cards that happened to be held by a black hand sold for less than the cards that happened to be held by a white hand. The financially prudent economists that they were, they also checked to see how much profit they made in their resale game, and they lost money overall. This was a study, not a business. But the cards lost more value when they were held by a black seller than by a white seller. And I could highlight all sorts of studies like this, where modern people's everyday ordinary decisions are affected by race. But what? I thought we were done with prejudice and racism. The polls! Look at the polls! People are saying they abhor racism and want equality. Could they really still be subject to bias, at least some of the time? I suppose Allport's Nature of Prejudice is still relevant after all. In a retrospective, some psychologists wrote that books written a decade ago are typically considered to be outdated. Yet half a century after its publication, the scope and endurance of The Nature of Prejudice's influence has been nothing short of remarkable. We still need a psychology of prejudice. And by the way, that quote comes from a piece co-written by a guy named Jack Dovidio, and that name sounds so familiar. Has he been on the show before? You're listening to Opinion Science, the show about our opinions, where they come from, and how we talk about them. And if you didn't figure it out, today's guest is Jack Dovidio, and what a guest he is. He's an emeritus professor at Yale University, and he's spent his career really defining how psychologists have thought about prejudice. It was super fun to talk to him for the podcast. We talk about his early days in the field, studying what makes people help each other in times of need, his pioneering work with Sam Gertner on the idea of aversive racism, or the possibility that people can be consciously opposed to prejudice, but still have lingering negative feelings about marginalized groups, and his more recent work on how bias can creep into medical care. So no more blabbing from me. Let's get right to it. to get us started, maybe you could tell us a little bit of that backstory. So if you zoom all the way back to the origin story, like, you were doing work on racial attitudes back in the 70s when, I think probably the field had a probably different relationship with that area of research than it does today. So I'm curious, like when you started out as a budding psychologist, were you planning on making a career out of studying racial attitudes, or like what was your initial inclination that got you into this whole mess?
Yeah, no, had no intentions of studying racial attitudes. I actually got into it through the helping behavior route as an undergraduate, in fact. And as an undergraduate, my very first study, which turned out to be my very first publication, was on helping behavior. And I had personal experiences related to discrimination and racial discrimination. When I was in college, I was an intern at what's called a Better Chance program, where there were Black and Latinx high school students that I tutored. But when I got to graduate school, kind of like the very first day, Sam Gertner, who was my advisor at the University of Delaware, sat me down and said, what our goal is for me to convince him to do the work I'm interested in, and for him to convince me to do the work he's interested in. And I put helping behavior on the table, and he put racial attitudes on the table, and that was what the next 5 decades basically work together has been, that kind of merger of that kind of interests that have been reciprocal and exciting, because it's a good push and pull.
What was it about helping behavior that maybe I missed that part? Like, why was that the thing you put on the table?
As an undergraduate, I had to do a research thesis. And in a class, I was with 3 other people that we had to do a project, most of whom I really didn't know. And in the project, I was just impressed of how the shared stress we had of having to come up with a project brought us closer together, and how helpful we were. Strangers people who started out as strangers suddenly became close confidants and had very valuable exchanges, which led to us coming up with a project on helping behavior. And that's been actually a theme that's gone through all my research, is looking at how we identify with other people affects whether or not we help them and when we help them.
So I think sometimes people have their own idea of what helping behavior means. So when you talk about helping behavior, like what are the sorts of things that you've like looked at whether people help or not? Like what do you mean by helping?
Yeah, I would say the kinds of things we looked at was things that were very trivial and spontaneous. So my very first study was about someone knocking over 100 pencils, a jar of 100 pencils, to see if people would pick them up and how much they would help and the ways they responded. And then on the other extreme, we looked at emergency interventions, staging emergencies that were seemingly life and death, and to see how people would respond in those kinds of very pressing situations where the stakes were very high. And then we tried to figure out, too, is why are people helping? Are you helping mainly to help yourself, to feel better about yourself? Or are you really motivated to put someone else's welfare as primary over yours? And that would be called altruism.
You mentioned these emergencies, and they always strike me as the great theater of social psychology sometimes when they get pulled off. Can you give us an example of like one of those early studies where you did this? Like what did you have to pull off in order to put people in that position?
Yeah, I mean, sort of I grew up in psychology in the Kitty Genovese, the person who was killed while 38 people witnessed the event and no one called the police. Dolly and Latine were writing books about why people don't help, and people were talking about bystander apathy. And so what we tried to do was create the kinds of life and death emergencies. And what we did was we basically, in one paradigm, had people what participants would be doing would be thinking that they're going to be participating in an ESP experiment with another person in another room. They would go by the room, they would see a messy room piled with a whole bunch of chairs and other things. It was like a storage room. We said that's where the person will be sending it. And then while they were receiving the ESP messages, all of a sudden there'd be an interruption where the other person, who was actually tape recorded, would say, gee, those chairs look like they're going to fall. The remarkable coincidence. And then there'd be this large crash of chairs falling down. And sometimes we would have the person groan and moan, obviously in pain. Sometimes they would call for help. And sometimes you would just hear the loud crash. But in all cases, you just sat there in silence when they were trying to receive ESP messages. So the experiment was clearly interrupted, but most people really believed that that was an actual emergency.
So you mentioned, so Sam was the one who put the racial attitudes on the table. Do you have a sense of where that came from? Like, was that stuff that he was doing already at the time?
Yeah, he had actually published some of the earliest work on aversive racism, a subtle form of racism. And basically, when I came in relatively early after he had started that research, and our collaborations were really about trying to develop the idea of aversive racism. And I'll explain what aversive racism is. Many of the people who were studying racial attitudes at the time, and as you said, there weren't a lot of people studying racial attitudes. It was a very interesting time period because it was post-civil rights era. There were a lot of changes going on, but yet it wasn't the kind of topic that people found a high priority. And in fact, some prominent psychologists told me not to study racial attitudes because they said race is too complicated and it's too applied. So they encouraged me to pursue other things, but it turns out I'm stubborn. And the nice thing about being an academic is you get to pursue the questions you want to pursue. So aversive racism was basically trying to go from the idea of who's prejudiced, trying to think that the old approach was if we could just identify who's prejudiced, I would call it the cancer approach. You can cut them out, and society will be better and pure from there on out. But what aversive racism was trying to do was not look at the attitude so much of the people who were open bigots, but the many people who said they weren't prejudiced, who probably truly believed that they weren't prejudiced, but they were still discriminating, often in subtle ways and complex ways. So it was really about the perpetuation of bias among what we called those people who are well-intentioned.
Is there? I'm curious where that idea stems from. So that's we're able to establish pretty well that that's something that happens. But in those beginning days, was it sort of like a curiosity looking at data where you're like, well, why are people saying one thing but doing another? Or more of like a hunch of like, I don't know, I keep hearing people say that they're over this issue. And yet, like, I don't believe them for one reason or another. So, like, what's the genesis of this kind of inclination that maybe people hold these divergent feelings at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, it was basically around, the bread and butter of social psychology at the time was studying attitudes. And we studied attitudes because they predict behavior. But when we got into the domain of racial attitudes, what people said their attitudes were, what people said even why they were doing what they were doing, didn't match their actual behavior. So there was this big disconnect, I would say, in our data, first of all, that the attitudes weren't predicting behavior. But in our interactions with participants, in the emergency study that I mentioned to you, I described, one of the things we found was that when people were exposed to that emergency and it was a black victim or a white victim, they were more likely to diffuse responsibility. That is, they were more likely to believe that if there were other people around, these other people would intervene. And so they chose not to help the black person. So they helped the black person less than the white person in that situation. But when I talked with them afterwards, and we discussed why they made their decisions, they generally avoided talking about the race of the victim when the victim was black. Even when I showed them information that the victim was black, many of them denied that they even noticed the race of the person. So clearly something was happening that was inconsistent, not only with what they were saying, but this is to me the important aspect of aversive racism. The behavior was inconsistent with what they believed their attitudes were, what they believed in many ways. And that made it really intriguing to me.
So how is it that someone can believe themselves to be unbiased and unprejudiced and still find themselves in these situations where their decisions are betraying those values?
Yeah, I mean, that was our big question, and one of the challenges at that time is that people talking about unconscious was frowned upon in social psychology because unconscious sounded Freudian psychodynamics. And, this is post Skinner. We have to look at behavior. We have to just take things at face value. That's the gold standard. And if people, you don't want to deal with introspection, basically. So that was kind of the challenge, is that how can you explain this if you don't have unconscious attitudes? So that led Sam Girton and I to propose that people had unconscious attitudes. And the whole idea behind this was that actually, rather than asking who's prejudiced, we would ask ourselves, why does prejudice exist in the first place? And when we looked at the psychological theories about why people might develop prejudice, and you've done podcasts on it, I've seen them very well, like social identity theory, is that we value members of our own group more than other groups, and that's a universal response. That we have grown up in a society that is racist, founded on the proposition that all men were created equal, and it took us over 200 years to pass legislation guaranteeing that. So basically what we concluded is that there are a lot of reasons why people would be biased. So the bias is likely to be in most people. And so the question was, what would lead people to say they're not biased? And that's where we began to say that there may be this dissociation between what they think and what they believe at some very basic level and what they think and believe at a very conscious level. And so we posited for a number of years that there were these unconscious biases that were driving many people. So it wasn't that they were lying to us about their attitudes, they just weren't aware of the depth of their biases. But let me just say that real quickly here. The problem with that approach for many years was this. When I would speak to an audience, I would say, on the one hand, we have overt bigots who say they're prejudiced and are prejudiced. On the other hand, we have aversive racists who say they're not prejudiced but are really prejudiced. So that means I just called all the white people in the audience prejudiced, okay? Which is not a good way to endear yourself to your audience, but also not a great way to do science, because you don't want to condemn races of people who are white or black or any group, and that's what we were doing. And so Sam and I both sort of independently did some projects where we tried to look at cognitive measures. What comes to mind most quickly? He used one particular technique, I developed another technique, and we began to do studies that showed back in the early 80s that most people have this dissociation, most white people, where they appear non-prejudiced in what they say very consciously, but we could see the evidence of these implicit biases, prejudice, and stereotypes in our other measures, and some of those implicit biases were predicting behavior better than what people said. That, of course, evolved into the work on the IAT, which we didn't do. Greenwald and Bernanke did, and that really became the gold standard of measuring the implicit biases. So that's kind of how this sort of evolved. It's kind of like bumping into things that you don't understand, taking a step back, trying to guess what would happen next, and then listening to what was going on in the literature and trying to adapt what other people were doing to sort of come at something from a different direction.
It's funny, as I think of you as someone who was quick to adopt the implicit association test as sort of like the implicit bias arises, and then there's like a trickle of research that becomes an explosion of research. And some of those earliest studies are ones that you were involved in. And I realize now that, like, oh, well, it's because you were already kind of doing it. Like, it just became an opportunity for you to pull it into the work that you were already building. And so it was sort of, it must have been like, I'm curious to get your take. Like, when you saw this measure emerge, did it click immediately like, oh my God, that's the thing. That's the thing we've been talking about? Or did it take some time to realize like, oh, actually, we're arriving at the same idea independently?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is, in the early days, I would say, pre-IAT, I had attended a small conference that Mazu Banaji was there. I had talked to Tony Greenwald, and so I wasn't surprised with what they were developing. They were telling me what they were developing, and it wasn't unrelated to what I was doing. It was just better than what I was doing. So I was a quick adopter for that. Because I already sort of believed the point that they were making, but I also believed that they had a much better measure in terms of something more reliable, something more stable. And I know the IAT has received a lot of criticism, but it predicts behavior, and that's what I wanted. And it to me is the idea that in academia, it's not a race where you have winners and losers. It really is a team effort in terms of what comes out of it. And I've always had a good relationship and never felt competitive, and they never expressed any kind of feeling of competitive with me. And that's the nice thing about social psychology. It's not zero sum, where one person wins and the other person loses. They come up with a great idea, and I get to borrow it.
It also, so the evolution of this helps clarify for me one of the things about the aversive racism, kind of the history of it, that I've sometimes had a hard time grappling with, which is that so my understanding is that in the earlier days, some of the studies were essentially saying that, like, if someone expresses explicitly and openly, like a non-prejudiced attitude, they could go on to show bias in their decision making, and that's aversive racism. Like, that's just the phenomenon. Whereas with the development of these measures, it gets more sophisticated, where you're saying, well, aversive racism is really like, it's not a universal truth of psychology, but it is what we would expect among people who both openly say they're non-prejudiced, but harbor measurable automatic negative reactions. Does that make sense? So it sort of began as a more kind of broad brush picture and became a little bit more of a nuanced picture. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I would say two other things to the nuance. One is the argument that I think is pretty well established now is that it's rooted in normal, the negative component is rooted in normal processes. It's socialization processes, it's in-group, out-group bias. It's not about good people and bad people. It's about being human. And the other part of this, I want to come back to, and just merge what you said with what I said. It's also possible that there are white people who are not prejudiced implicitly and explicitly. And that's important to acknowledge. And it's important. It's an important research question, because you want to ask, how can people be non-prejudiced? Well, start by looking at the people who are non-prejudiced. And we found that those who are low in implicit, low in explicit, were also low in discriminatory behavior as well. So it completes the picture. And again, that's the exciting thing, is that people talk about defending their theories. I don't want to defend a theory. And I would always tell my students that my participants are smarter than me, so we should listen to them. And it really produces that kind of evolution that you were just talking about, from this kind of universal approach. and a blunt, very blunt approach to something that's much more nuanced and I think much more productive.
The other nuance too that I might be worth emphasizing is it the case that aversive racism just predicts biased behavior no matter what? Or are there certain ways in which this kind of duality of implicit and explicit attitudes shows up in people's decisions where other times people might not actually be expected to discriminate, even if they harbor these implicit biases?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. The way we try to conceive of this is that we have implicit biases and we have explicit biases, and we have explicit ways of being non-prejudiced too. But it's not the unconscious or the implicit system. And implicit doesn't necessarily mean unconscious, but it's a much more automatic. Let me just explain this for a minute, that implicit biases occur because they're overlearned habits of mind, okay? It's not about the ego and the id and all these other things. It's an energy-saving device that allows us to make decisions quickly, which is important from an evolutionary point of view, that if we have to contemplate every decision, we would have been eaten a long time ago, basically. But we all develop all sorts of implicit ways of thinking that are very functional. So, for example, if you drive the same route to work every single day, have you ever had the experience that all of a sudden you find yourself in the parking lot? And what you had been doing that day was driving implicitly, okay? It was overlearned. You make this route every single day, but it doesn't mean that if something runs out in front, you're going to keep driving. And what it did was it freed you up to think all the way to work about all the other things that you needed to think about consciously that day. A presentation, meeting with somebody. So we have these two systems that are not in conflict, they work together. And what that means is sometime one is going to take precedence over another. And what we hypothesized and we found over and over again is when you put people in a situation where right and wrong is clearly defined, where appropriate behavior is clearly defined, then the explicit system assesses that, and that's how you behave. So you go and do what you think is the right thing because you know what the right thing is. It takes precedence. But if you put people in a situation where right and wrong is not clearly defined, or in situations are complex where there's no right answer, then the implicit system gives you the first step in a particular direction, and it affects what you look at, what you attend to, what you interpret. Let me just give you one quick research example. We would give participants information about an applicant for a job. They believed that their input would affect the job outcome. The applicant was either black or white, and in some cases, the applicant had impeccably strong credentials. In other cases, they had a mixture of good credentials and bad credentials, but arguably they were good enough for the job based on pre-testing that we did. When the applicant had impeccably good credentials, no discrimination against the black applicant, implicit biases don't have any effect there. But when the applicant has mixed credentials, what we found is there was a bias against the black relative to the white applicant. And other researchers, Leanne Son-Hing, had showed that more implicitly biased people would tend to take the minority candidate and rate them lower. And what happens there is when it's ambiguous, you go with your gut feeling. That gut feeling is reflective of your implicit biases. And so what people would do is, particularly those more implicitly biased, is when the applicant was a majority group member, you would attend to and pay attention to the good aspects of their CV. And when the applicant was a minority and the participant was white, then people would be attending more to the weaknesses of the candidate. And so when you ask them why did they recommend hiring one candidate over another, they had credentials to point to, good for the white, bad for the black. And so they would say it had nothing to do with race, it has everything to do with credentials. And so that brings the sort of implicit biases it depends on the situation, which is the meat and potatoes of social psychology, but it's a very predictable kind of result where good people will do good things when they know what to do, but in a world that's complex, there's a lot of leakage.
And in a way that people can sort of say, well, I can prove to you this wasn't racially biased because look at all of these great things this person did. It strikes me that aversive racism is sneaky in this way, in that it provides a cover story for bias. It sort of like gives people this out where it's a process by which people can justify the decisions they make as non-biased.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. I mean, that's a great summary of it because there is something you can point to legitimately, but it still doesn't mean that it's even. And the reality is, even if your bias is subtle, it's bias and it has negative outcomes. And let me just tell you one other negative outcome that doesn't jump out in the literature, but it's one that we find, is that one of the dangers of aversive racism is what I would say cultural miscommunication and mistrust. So let's just take the study I just mentioned to you. If you are the person doing the hiring, you see two candidates, a white and a black candidate, and your biases lead you to look differently at the two candidates and their credentials. So what happens is you're the first interviewer. You interview this person and you say, yeah, what we're really looking for is someone who has a science degree, not a humanities degree. And of course, that's the white person over the black person. You walk away from that situation with a clear conscience. Race had nothing to do with it. Now, that person goes for another interview. That black person goes for another interview. They get another white interviewer. And that white interviewer says, you're really very good. But we're looking for someone with sales experience, not someone who doesn't have it. And I'm sorry, you're very good, but we're hiring somebody else. And then that black person goes to a third interviewer who comes up with another, as you said, rationalization, which can be totally different. So now 3 white interviewers walk away saying, there's no bias here, and certainly I'm not biased. But from the perspective of the black candidate, what ties those 3 experiences together? It's race. It's not experience. It's not a technical degree. It's not whatever the third explanation was. And so white people tend to see racism nowhere because it's not in our realm of experience. But people of color that see this bias over and over again, they see it from a very different perspective because the most logical, parsimonious, reasonable explanation for why they didn't get these 3 jobs is not any of the individual explanation, it's race. And so that leads to this, what I would call racial distrust. And I'll just say, one of the things I learned from this is when I interact with a white person, because I'm white, I typically assume my default is they trust me. When I interact with a person of color, what I've learned is they don't see me as the way I see me. They see me as a white person. And all the experiences that they've had should lead to distrust. And so what I assume is that the person I'm interacting with doesn't trust me. I accept that. I understand why. But that means my initial activities in our interaction is trust building, or at least acknowledgement that you may not trust me. And so I can't be colorblind in my approach in the way I interact with people because color matters.
That is a very useful insight. I was going to, one of my things I was going to ask you was like, what have you learned about yourself from this program of research? And you went right for it, which is great. My last question about aversive racism, though, is why is it called that? I always struggle with the terminology. So what is it that is aversive here?
It's interesting. It actually came out of a term that somebody else that Sam mentioned years ago, and Sam adopted. So the definition has sort of, there's a mythology behind what it really means. But I would say that there's one of the aspects of it is that it's a kind of racism that those who have it would find aversive. because it's so inconsistent with our self-image, it's inconsistent with our values, and so it's a kind of racism that we experience aversively when we sense that we have it. The other version of this that Sam, again, these theories always evolve, but one of the things that Sam's early work on aversive racism showed is that when you put white people in a situation where the norms were clear, there would be no discrimination. But what many white people would choose would be to avoid black people entirely, because then they never get put in that difficult situation. And so they avoid, and they would typically find interactions with black people aversive, and therefore would avoid them. So, and probably next week we'll come up with another.
Yeah. This might be a good time to shift gears and talk about some of the more recent work on applying, I think, the same kind of insights, but in a particular domain. So you've done a lot of work in recent years on how these kinds of racial biases can play out in a medical context. And so where did that perspective, where did that interest come from? And why is this a domain where it might be especially useful to study these dynamics?
Yeah, the interest, again, so many of my interests just sort of snuck up on me. And there's a lot of chance in it. Back in around 2000, I got involved with the National Academy of Sciences and Institute of Medicine report on racial disparities in healthcare. And on this panel, someone invited me, and I think I'm a person of low self-esteem. When someone invites me, I get flattered. And, National Academy of Science, I'll go. But actually, it was a very transformative experience for me, because I got to learn a lot about medicine. But it was also transformative is I got to contribute a lot in the book. I was the only social psychologist talking about implicit bias at the time. And that report has gotten a lot of attention over the years and introduced the idea of implicit bias in medicine. And the reason that's so important is, in terms of the linkage, is that people go into medicine because they want to help people. People go into medicine and become very well educated, and well educated people tend to be liberal and hold values of equality. But at the same time, what we see is big and persistent racial disparities in health across our history. Infant mortality rates are about as bad now in terms of disparities as it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. So how can you reconcile good people and these disparate outcomes? And again, many people wanted to blame the victim. Oh, it's because of people not doing healthy things. But what we're also beginning to see is there seemed to be, I talked about mistrust a few minutes ago, but there was high levels of medical mistrust of people of color. Why? Again, people would say, oh, look at historically, there were these experiments on black people. That's the reason. But there was also some interesting evidence that showed, for example, that they interviewed patients going to see a doctor for the first time. The patient filled out a questionnaire about how much they trusted the doctor before they went into the room and met the doctor. And then they filled it out as they were leaving. And what they found was that white people tend to trust their doctor a lot before they meet him, and trust him a lot after they meet him. Black people trusted the doctor before they met them, not quite as much, but they trusted the doctor less after they met the doctor. So that's nothing about history, not directly about history, but something is going on in that interaction that's undermining it. And so, I had this interest and wrote some papers on it. And then Lou Penner, my good friend and collaborator, he moved from University of South Florida from a psychology department to a cancer institute with his wife. And, research and friendships tend to go together. research collaborations. And so it gave me access to research populations and resources, and Lou took a great lead in most of the research where we converted him to aversive racism. And let me just say, he's going to ask me about this. And it led to the publication of this book, Cambridge University 2023, available on Amazon.
Lou is the one who set this up, and so I'm this is a direct shout out because I know that he's listening to this. So you've enough work to fill a book. What are the kinds of things that you do? Like once you have access to this kind of participant population, what are the first questions that you go like? Well, we have to first establish this. What do those first days look like?
Yeah, the first thing is, again, the challenges with there are practical challenges with the medical community in the sense that one is that, and I had done some work with the military, I would say that it's like this too, is that they believe that they're not prejudiced. They know in their heart they're not prejudiced. They're well-educated, well-intentioned people. So to bring in researchers to show that they might be prejudiced is a big lift in some ways, because it's inviting people to challenge the way you think and tell you you're not as good as you believe you are. But the leverage that Lou and his wife Terry Albrecht had in certain clinics allowed us to tape recordings, video record interactions with doctors and patients. And one of the first things we did in one of the earliest studies was we measured doctors' implicit and explicit racial attitudes. And then we recorded their interactions with patients. And then we asked some questions after the interaction of the doctor, like specifically, how much did you try to include the patient in this medical decision making? And then the patient was asked questions like, how friendly did you find the doctor? And how much do you trust the doctor? And kind of the key finding we had there was this, that if you think about 4 different theoretically groups of people, of which there were mainly 3 types, you have people who are low in explicit prejudice and low in implicit prejudice. And we did find doctors in that category. You have doctors who are high in explicit prejudice and high in implicit prejudice. And we found a few doctors in that category. The next category we typically find doctors are those who are low. They say they're not, in their explicit, say they're not prejudiced, but do have implicit biases. And by the way, doctors have the same level of implicit bias on the average as the average person who takes the IAT. Okay? And then there's a 4th category that doesn't really exist, but only theoretically in the model, which is people who say they're prejudiced explicitly but don't have implicit biases. But the bottom line here was this. Doctors who were more explicitly prejudiced were more likely to admit that they didn't involve their patient in decision making, Black patient. So I'm only talking about black patients here. So they were willing to say, I didn't work that hard to involve the Black patient in decision making. That's a conscious attitude. But the implicit attitudes of the doctor predicted how friendly patients and respected patients felt with the doctor. So doctors who are more implicitly biased communicated less friendliness and being less respectful to Black patients. But the biggest place of mistrust was the Black patients tended to trust doctors who were low in explicit and implicit prejudice the most. There was a lot of trust for low prejudice. There was much less trust in a doctor who was high prejudiced, high explicit and high implicit. But the lowest level of trust was the doctor who said they weren't prejudiced, low explicit, but who had implicit biases. And so that level of mistrust was because the doctor would be sending mixed signals, saying the right things, but their nonverbal behavior would undermine what they were saying. And when you get those mixed messages, you don't trust people. And medical trust is so important to whether or not you adhere to the medical recommendations, how you interpret the medical recommendations, whether you recommend the doctor, and whether or not you even return to the doctor. So that was saying that even in situations like that, where the doctor wants the patient to get better, and the patient wants to get better, the aversive racism is undermining the effectiveness of that interaction.
To be clear, too, so it's not as though these patients are learning directly that, like, oh, my doctor on a survey said that they're not prejudiced, but implicitly they are. It's just that these doctors who happen to be people who would voice low prejudice and score high on prejudice on an implicit measure are just engaging in this interaction in such a way that they're just sending these mixed signals, right? Like, you have the recordings, right? It's not that they're saying necessarily stuff about race or stuff about these sorts of things, but they're just handling this situation in a way that puts these patients kind of ill at ease.
Right. And, in subsequent work, I'll just say that, you've got to understand, I don't want people to think that this work is about beating up on doctors. It's not about good or bad. But we also find that Black patients who tend to be high on mistrust, who have experienced a lot of discrimination, are particularly attuned to that kind of negative mismatch, that subtle bias, and therefore they push back on it. And then you get this interaction becomes the worst interaction because the doctor doesn't understand why the patient is pushing back and makes negative attributions, and the patient is suspicious of the doctor and the doctor's actions, and it begins to spiral. And nobody has talked about race. That's not on the table. We're talking about a medical condition, and we're talking about interactions that often last maybe 15 to 20 minutes. But when you have a lifetime of experiences, both white people and Black people, that can trigger a lot of things very quickly.
Since you have the recordings of these interactions, do you have a sense of what is going on in these conversations that is not facilitating a smooth interaction?
We struggled with that. We struggled with that a lot. I mean, it's. And one of the problems is, one of the challenges is this, and we found this within other research, not in a medical setting, is that the explicit attitudes of white people tend to predict how verbally friendly they are. The implicit attitudes tend to predict our nonverbal behavior. And the nonverbal behavior can be anywhere from voice tone, posture, eye contact with the person, angle of interaction. There are so many multiple channels. I can tell you with not so much in the medical work, but in the general research, whenever we try to key in on particular measures, is it eye contact? Is it somebody's posture? The individual behaviors weren't as good predictors as if you asked people to look at the tapes and said, how friendly is this person? What we found is that people have to integrate it, and it's because people show their behaviors in different ways. We show our aversion. Sometimes people are very facially expressive, and sometimes we're not. So it's trying to tap into what it is specifically has been very hard, but we know people can detect it. And when we look at the patients and we look at what observers say, they tend to match.
So we have this dilemma of well-meaning doctors who are nevertheless conveying not optimal signals. Do we have a sense of what to do about it? Like, how could we make this situation better?
Yeah, that's the big challenge. So let's work through the problem for a minute. So what we've argued is that most white Americans grow up in a society where, first of all, because we're human, we value white people more than Black people on average, in-group and social identity. Second of all, we've been socialized in terms of our history about the higher status of white people over Black people and stereotypes of white people being more positive than Black people. And the argument is that implicit biases are automatically activated. They're difficult to overcome, that you can't suppress them. You're not a slave to them, right? I mean, I tell people the example is, I go into the supermarket, I'm hungry, I want to eat it, I see apples, I like apples, but I don't eat an apple in the supermarket because I know what's wrong. In the middle of the night, I'll be driving down the road, I get a red light, nobody's around, I will stop at the red light, even though I want to get home. We're not a slave to our implicit biases, but when they're activated, they move us in a particular direction. One of the things I've learned with my research, and I spent a lot of time working with colleagues in Europe, is that I don't talk about American racism to European audiences. They don't get it. Someone raises their hand and says, so why does one drop of black blood determine someone's fate? And it makes no sense. So one of the things we think about is that if we just take the case that race is important in America because we've been told race is important as we've grown up in America. But the reality is we socially categorize on the basis of so many other different dimensions. On gender, height, on age, and it's not that my friends in Europe don't have biases. My friends in northern Italy talk about the southern Italians. My relatives came from southern Italians, but suddenly they feel they can talk to me about it. But they have these biases we all have these group biases, but we can categorize people on many different dimensions. And what I want to say is this, that in answer to your question, Sam Gertner and I did work on the common in-group identity model. And the idea is, if we can make our common identity salient, we can notice race, but it's not going to drive our interaction. So one of the things I'll just say quickly here is that what we did in some of the work with Lou Penner and Sam Gertner is that in a clinic, we asked doctors and patients, we gave them a lot of materials that emphasized in one condition that they were on the same team. We had posters, doctors, have information you want, and patients have information that doctors want, that you are trying to solve the same problem. We had little reminders because they were like yellow pins, yellow pens, yellow everything, that you were part of the yellow team. And then in another part of the clinic, it was just standard of care. And what we found is that once you got doctors and patients thinking about them being on the same team, they were now suddenly acting as an in-group. And that in-group led to more positive interactions, greater trust among Black patients, and greater trust that Black patients had of their physicians, who in that condition of same team, led to greater adherence to the medical recommendations down the road. So the idea is, I don't want to be thought police. I don't want to change people in some fundamental way. I just want to help them become better. And the way to do it is to say, there are more important things in this situation than race. And if you can think about what those more important things are and how you have them in common, then all your in-group biases are going to benefit that interaction because they no longer divide you, they're going to bring you together. And you're going to trust people more, you're going to like people more, you're going to care about people more. And so the idea is to think about proactively, positively what you can do, rather than keep telling people that they're not good enough.
That is a nice, hopeful, inspirational note to end on. So I think I'm going to call it right there and just say thanks so much for taking the time. I've been a fan of the work that you've done for so long, and it was great to get a chance to talk.
Oh, great. And thank you. I know you're in a rush, but I've looked at all, I won't say all your podcasts, but you do a great job, and I really appreciate it.
Alrighty, big thanks to Jack Dovidio for taking the time to talk about his work. I've been such a fan of his approach to science, and he's mentored some incredible people in the field, too, so I was lucky he was up for coming on the podcast. As I mentioned briefly, shout out to Lou Penner, Jack's colleague, who suggested having him on the show. This is a good chance to plug the book that Lou and Jack and others wrote that came out a few months ago. It's called Unequal Health: Anti-Black Racism and the Threat to Americans' Health. There's a link to it in the show notes. To find out more about this show, go to opinionsciencepodcast.com. Follow the show on whatever social medias are left, and subscribe to the show with your favorite podcast purveyor so you don't miss anything. And you know what? Speaking of big things ahead, the podcast schedule is a little wonky over the next couple weeks, but it's for good reason. So in 2 weeks, you don't get a new episode. Sorry. But I will drop the trailer for a special podcast series on how psychology changed the game for how economists think about things. 2 weeks after that, all 5 episodes of that series will show up in the podcast feed. That's right, multiple hours of delight handed to you for free all at once. 2 weeks later, we're back to the Opinion Science schedule you know and love. New interviews every other Monday. Okay, you've got your planner all filled in? Great. Thanks for listening today, and I'll see you when I see you for more Opinion Science. Bye-bye.